I scattered my husband's ashes 14 months ago. Last Tuesday, he signed for a package at my front door. I had stood at the edge of Georgian Bay on a gray October morning, my daughter beside me, the wind pulling the ashes from the urn before I was ready to let go. 14 months of learning how to make coffee, for one. 14 months of turning down the thermostat because there was no longer anyone to complain it was too cold. 14 months of waking up at 3 in the morning reaching for a hand that was not there. Or so I thought. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had ordered a new set of curtains from a shop in Owen Sound, the kind of errand that feels almost embarrassing in its smallness. I was in the backyard when the delivery notification came through on my phone. A signature was required. I had missed it. But the app showed a photo of the signed slip left at the door. I almost did not look closely. I almost just rescheduled. But something made me zoom in on the signature. My thumb and forefinger spread across the screen slowly, the way you do when you already feel something shifting in your chest before you understand why. The handwriting was unmistakable. That particular looping R, the way the letters leaned slightly to the left as if in a hurry, the same signature I had watched my husband write on birthday cards, on mortgage papers, on the back of checks for 38 years. Robert. My phone slipped from my hand onto the patio stones. I stood there in the September air, the smell of the neighbors' burning leaves drifting over the fence, and I could not breathe. Robert had died of a sudden cardiac arrest on the kitchen floor of our home in Collingwood. He was 64. The paramedics said there was nothing to be done by the time they arrived. Our daughter had flown in from Vancouver. Our son had driven up from Toronto. We had a service at the United Church where we had been married 38 years before. I stood at a podium and read a poem he had always loved. I held myself together until I reached the last line, and then I did not. I picked up my phone. I stared at the signature again. I told myself grief does things to the mind. I told myself handwriting can look similar. I told myself I was a 62-year-old woman standing alone in her backyard looking for her dead husband in a courier app notification, and that I should go inside and make tea. I went inside. I did not make tea. I called the courier company. The representative was polite but unhelpful. She could not give me information about the person who had signed. She confirmed only that the delivery had been accepted at my address and that the item had been left with the signatory as per standard procedure. I asked if she could describe him. She said she was not able to share that information. I thanked her and hung up. Then I pulled up every photo of Robert I had on my phone. His last birthday in August, just 2 months before he died. Us at my sister's cottage in Muskoka that same summer. His hands on the steering wheel on a road trip we had taken to Cape Breton the year before. His handwriting on the grocery list still pinned to the corkboard in the kitchen, because I could not bring myself to take it down. The R. The left-leaning letters. I did not sleep that night. The following morning I called the courier company again. This time I asked a different question. I asked whether the driver who had come to my address could be contacted to confirm the package had been signed by the correct resident. There was a pause. The representative said she would file a note. I asked if a supervisor was available. The supervisor was not available. I left my number. By noon, I had driven to the courier depot on the edge of town myself. The young man at the counter looked at me the way young people look at older women who are being inconvenient. I showed him the photo on my phone. I explained that I lived alone and had not been home and needed to know who had accepted the delivery at my address. He said he could not share personal information about drivers or signatories. I said I understood, and I asked if I could speak to the route driver personally. He said the driver for my route was named Gary. I said thank you. I waited in the parking lot for 40 minutes until a van with the company logo pulled in. I got out of my car. Gary was in his mid-30s, stocky, friendly-looking. I showed him the photo of the signed slip on my app. I asked him what the man who signed it looked like. Gary frowned slightly. He said it was an older gentleman, tall, silver hair, a little long at the back. He said the man had been standing on the porch as if he was expecting the delivery. Gary had assumed he was the homeowner's husband or a relative. My mouth went dry. I thanked Gary and walked back to my car and sat there with both hands on the steering wheel for a very long time. Robert had been tall. His hair had gone silver before he was 50, and he wore it slightly longer than most men his age because he had never much cared for haircuts. He had stood on that porch 10,000 times. I thought about the ways grief can fracture a mind. I thought about my friend Patricia in Barrie, who had seen her late mother in a shopping center 2 weeks after the funeral. I thought about all the reasonable explanations a sensible woman in her 60s should consider before doing what I was about to do. Then I drove home and checked the security camera I had installed above the front door after a package was stolen 2 winters ago. The footage was still there. I had not checked it in weeks. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and scrubbed through the file. Tuesday, 11. 47 inches the morning. A courier van. Gary getting out with a box, ringing the bell, waiting, and then the door opening. The man who opened it had his back mostly to the camera. Tall, silver hair. A dark green jacket I recognized because I had bought it at a shop in Collingwood 3 Christmases ago and given it to my husband. He took the package, he signed the slip. He started to turn back toward the door. For just under 2 seconds his profile was visible. My husband has a scar that runs along his left jaw, thin and pale now, from a bicycle accident when he was 11 years old. He used to joke that it was the reason he always grew a beard in November, to cover it up for the cold months. The man on the camera did not have a beard. It was September. The scar was visible. I closed the laptop. I sat very still. I thought, if Robert is alive, then what did I scatter into Georgian Bay? I did not call anyone that night. I needed to think clearly before I said a word to another person. I went to bed at 9 o'clock and stared at the ceiling until past 2 in the morning. I thought about the cremation. I thought about the fact that I had never been asked to formally identify the body. The paramedics, the hospital, the funeral home, the paperwork had all moved so quickly. Our son had handled most of it. He had said it was because he wanted to protect me. He had said I was too devastated to deal with the administrative details. He had insisted on a specific funeral home, one in Barrie, not in Collingwood where we had lived for 20 years and where everyone knew us. He said it was because they had availability, and the service in Collingwood could still happen in the church. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. At 2 in the morning, I thought of nothing else. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the spare room. I found the death certificate. I read it the way you read something when you are looking for a reason to stop worrying, and I found the opposite. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. The place of death was listed as the home address. The time was listed as 7:22 inches the morning. All of it consistent with what I had been told. But the certificate had been filed and collected by our son, Daniel. His signature was on the cremation authorization form. I filed everything back carefully. Then I went to the kitchen and made tea I did not drink. On Thursday morning, I called a private investigator whose name I had found through the Law Society of Ontario referral service. His office was in Barrie, on a side street near the waterfront. I drove the 40 minutes without telling anyone where I was going. He was in his late 50s. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and had the manner of someone who had heard too many things to be surprised by any of them. I sat across from his desk and told him everything. Not the grief, not the 38 years. The facts, the signature, the courier, the security footage, the scar, the jacket. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. He said, "If the footage is as clear as you describe, and if the documentation was handled by one family member without your direct involvement, there are avenues worth pursuing." He said it carefully. "The way people say things when they believe you, but want to protect you from how serious it actually is." I told him I did not need protecting. I needed information. He named his retainer. I wrote the check. On the drive home, I pulled over on the highway shoulder just past Stainer and sat there for a few minutes with the engine running. 18-wheelers moved past me like weather. I thought about the woman I had been 14 months ago, standing in this same car in the parking lot of the hospital after they told me, calling my daughter in Vancouver and not being able to get the words out. That woman had believed everything she was told because she had no reason not to, because she had trusted the two people who handled everything, because grief does not leave room for suspicion. I pulled back onto the highway and drove home. 2 days later, Daniel called. He called every Sunday without fail, which I had always found comforting. I answered as I always did. I asked about the children. He asked if I needed anything. I told him I had been doing some sorting of old paperwork and had come across some documents related to the estate that I had questions about. I kept my voice light and easy. He paused for just a moment too long before saying, "Of course, whatever I needed." I asked him which funeral home in Barrie he had used and why, again, not accusingly. Just a mother, revisiting details, the way grieving people do sometimes. He said it had been the closest one with availability on short notice. He said he had found them online. He said he wanted to make sure everything was taken care of properly. I said I understood. I thanked him. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down exactly how long that pause had been before he answered. I wrote down the slight change in his tone. I had been a high school English teacher for 31 years. I had spent decades listening to teenagers tell me things that were almost true. I knew the sound of a rehearsed answer. The investigator called me 8 days after our first meeting. He asked me to come in. The folder on his desk was not large, but everything in it was precise. He had traced the funeral home in Barrie to a business registered 2 years before Robert's death. The registered owner was a man with no prior funeral service credentials. The business had since been dissolved. Robert's cremation had been authorized and processed through this home with no independent verification of identity. A cremation order requires a physician's death certificate and next of kin authorization. Both had been signed. The physician listed on the death certificate had retired and relocated to Portugal 6 months after the filing. He showed me property records next. A property in Wasaga Beach, registered 18 months ago under a numbered company. The company director was listed using a name I did not recognize, but the emergency contact on the utility account was Daniel's cell phone number. Then he showed me bank records obtained through proper legal channels, joint accounts Robert and I had held together. In the 8 months before his supposed death, a total of $412,000 had been moved in incremental transfers, just under $10,000 at a time, into an account I had never seen. Robert had a pension through his work as a civil engineer with the municipality. The pension had been redirected following the death certificate filing. It no longer came to me. It had been redirected to a new account opened 4 days after he died. The investigator set down the last page and looked at me over his reading glasses. He said, "This is beyond what a private investigator can resolve. This needs to go to the RCMP and potentially to the Ontario Securities Commission." He said there may also be implications under the criminal code for fraud, identity falsification, and potentially the falsification of a public document. I asked him, Is there any version of this that is not what it looks like? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have not found one. I thanked him. I took the folder. I drove to the parking lot of a Tim Hortons on the way home and sat there for a long time. People came and went with coffee cups and paper bags. An older couple walked past holding hands. I watched them until they were gone. I thought, 38 years. I thought, the poem at the podium. I thought, Georgian Bay in October and the wind. Then I thought, he is in Wasaga Beach. He is 30 minutes away from where I am sitting right now. I did not go there that day. I went home. I called a lawyer, a woman in Collingwood who had handled our property sale years before and whom I trusted. I told her I needed to meet urgently. She had an opening the following morning. She read through the investigator's file without speaking for a long time. When she looked up, her expression was steady, the kind of steady that takes years to learn. She said the pension redirection alone was grounds for immediate legal action. She said the fraudulent death certificate, if proven, was a criminal matter, not a civil one. She said I would need to give a formal statement, and that from that point forward, events would move quickly and would be largely out of my hands. I asked her, before that happens, I need to speak to my son. She advised against it. I told her I understood her advice. I called Daniel and told him I needed him to drive up to Collingwood. I said I was not well. Not a lie, I told myself. Not entirely. He arrived that evening. He let himself in the way he always had, the spare key under the ceramic pot on the porch that had been in the same place for 20 years. He found me at the kitchen table. I had made dinner. Simple things. Roast chicken, potatoes, the green beans he had liked since he was small. We ate mostly without talking. I asked about his children. He answered. I watched his face across the table. The face I had watched since the first moment I saw it, 29 years ago, small and furious and new. I thought, I am about to break something that cannot be repaired. After dinner, I set the folder on the table between us. He looked at it. He did not ask what it was. That was when I knew, completely, and without any remaining doubt, that my son had known what he was looking at from the moment he walked into the kitchen. I said, Tell me. He did not speak for a long time. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. He looked at the window where the dark had gathered outside. He was 41 years old, and in that moment he looked much younger and much older than that at the same time. He said, Dad came to me a year before. He said he had been living 2 lives. He said there was a woman in Wasaga Beach. He said it had been going on for 11 years. I said nothing. He said he told me he wanted out. Not a divorce, because of the pension, the property, the assets. He said if he divorced you, he would lose too much of what he had spent his whole life building. The kitchen was very quiet. He said he found a man, someone with no family, terminally ill, who needed money for care. Dad paid him, paid for his care, made arrangements. When the man died, he died under Dad's name. I handled the paperwork. I knew the funeral home. I set it up. I asked, and the money? He said, Dad transferred most of it before. I helped him move what was left. I thought I would take care of you. I thought I could manage it quietly. Make sure you had enough. He transferred his voice. I thought it would be kinder. You were so destroyed. I thought knowing would break you more. I said, You thought it would be kinder to let me scatter a stranger's ashes into Georgian Bay. He put his face in his hands. I said, You watched me stand at that podium. He said nothing. I said, You held my hand at the reception afterward when your aunt said how strong I was. He made a sound I had never heard from him before, low and broken. and nothing like someone who had calculated anything. It was the sound of someone who had been carrying something impossible and had finally set it down in the worst possible place. I stood up from the table. I took the folder. I told him I needed him to go home. He said, "Mum, please." I said, "I love you. I have loved you your entire life, but you need to go home now, because tomorrow morning I am giving this folder to the police, and I need tonight to be the last time I am only your mother before I become the person who reported you." He stood in the hallway for a long time before he left. I heard his car on the gravel. Then the house was quiet again. I washed the dishes. I wiped the counter. I put the leftover chicken in the refrigerator. I did these things very carefully and very slowly, the way you do when you need something ordinary to hold on to. The following morning, I drove to the OPP detachment in Collingwood. I had called ahead. A detective met me in a small room with institutional gray walls and a water cooler in the corner. I placed the investigator's report on the table, and I told them everything I have told you now, from the courier notification to the signature to the security footage to the folder on the lawyer's desk. The detective asked me several questions. She took notes. She was professional and unhurried, and she looked at me the way you want to be looked at when you are saying something that sounds impossible, like she believed me. She said they would be in touch. They were in touch the following Thursday morning. Warrants had been obtained. Daniel had been contacted. My husband, using the name he had given himself in Wasaga Beach, had been located at the property. Officers from the OPP fraud unit had attended. I was sitting in my backyard when the detective called. The sky was the particular pale blue that only happens in Ontario in late September, when summer is finished, but the cold has not yet arrived. The maple at the back fence had started turning. Robert had planted that tree the year we moved in. He had said it would be spectacular in 20 years, and he had been right. I thought about that when the detective called. I thought about how he had been right about the tree. I drove to Wasaga Beach that afternoon, not because I had been asked to, because I needed to close something. The property was a well-kept bungalow on a quiet street 3 blocks from the waterfront. Gray siding, a green front door, a garden that had been properly tended. There was a woman sitting on the front step when I arrived, mid-50s, red hair going silver, wearing a quilted vest. She looked up when I got out of my car. She had the look of someone who had been crying for several hours and had decided to stop. I told her my name. I told her I was Robert's wife, legal wife. I told her I was not there to blame her for anything she had not known. She said, "He told me he was a widower. He said his wife had passed before he retired. He said he had nobody." I said, "He had me. He had 2 children. He had a grandchild he video called every Sunday morning." She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." I believed her. That surprised me. I did not stay long. I drove home along the 26, the bay visible in long gray glimpses between the trees. I thought about 38 years and what they had actually contained. I thought about the things that had been real, and there had been real things. I was old enough and honest enough to know that. The camping trips in Algonquin, the winter he stayed up for 3 nights when I had pneumonia, the way he always bought the expensive Balderson cheddar from the farmer's market, even when I told him we should save money. Real things. And underneath them, for 11 years, something else entirely. The legal process moved forward without my having to manage much of it. That was the part nobody tells you about. Once the truth is in official hands, it stops being only yours to carry. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit became involved. The fraudulent death certificate, the redirection of pension funds, the falsified cremation documents, the use of another person's identity, each item carried its own weight under the Criminal Code of Canada. Robert suffered a stroke 6 weeks after his arrest, while the case was still in the early stages of processing. He died in hospital in Barrie in November. He was 65 years old. I was listed as next of kin. A nurse called me at 7 in the morning. She was kind. She said he had not suffered. I sat for a while before I responded. I asked that any arrangements be handled by the estate. I said there would be no service. There was a pause on the line. She said she understood. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I felt the way you feel when a very long book ends on the last page, not happy or sad but simply finished. Aware that you have been changed by the reading of it, even if the ending was not the one you wanted. Daniel accepted a plea agreement in the spring. He was sentenced to 2 years less a day in a provincial facility for fraud over $5,000 and for his role in the falsification of a public document. The pension funds and transferred assets were partially recovered through the court process. My lawyer was thorough, and I trusted her. My daughter flew in from Vancouver when the sentencing was done. She had not known any of it. She had wept for a week when I first told her, not just for what her father had done, but for what her brother had done. For what I had lived through without anyone knowing. She slept in the guest room for 2 weeks, and we watched old films in the evenings and drank too much tea, and sometimes did not say anything at all, which is the best thing another person can offer you sometimes. I visited Daniel once, in the late autumn. It was not forgiveness. It was not even reconciliation. It was something quieter than both of those things. I sat across from him at a table in a visiting room with fluorescent lighting, and I looked at my son, who had made a terrible choice for what he believed were complicated reasons, and I said what I needed to say. I said, "I needed you to be honest with me. That was all I ever needed from you. Not protection, not management, honesty." He said, "I know." I said, "I love you. That hasn't changed. But I can't protect you from this, and I won't try." He nodded. He did not argue. It was the first time in the whole long year of it that he did not try to explain himself further, and that, strangely, was the thing that felt most like my son. The house in Collingwood feels different now. I repainted the living room a color called soft sage, because I had always wanted to, and Robert had always wanted the walls to stay white. I joined a watercolor class on Wednesday mornings at the Arts Center. I am not talented, but I have discovered that you do not need to be talented to enjoy something, which is a lesson that arrives late for some of us. I go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I buy the expensive Balderson cheddar. I allow myself that. Last October I went back to Georgian Bay. I stood at the same rocky point where I had stood with my daughter 14 months before. The water was the same, indifferent and cold and very beautiful. I thought about what I had scattered there, a stranger whose name I would never know, who had been used in his last weeks to sustain someone else's deception. I said something quiet to the water for him. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense. It made sense to me. I have stopped asking whether any of it was real. I have started asking different questions instead. What kind of woman do I want to be on the other side of this? What I still have to offer the years I have remaining. What it means to finally be answerable only to myself. Grief, it turns out, is not the worst thing. The worst thing is mourning a lie. But even that, if you survive it, teaches you something. I no longer confuse endurance with acceptance. I no longer confuse silence with peace. And I no longer confuse someone else's version of my life for the truth of it. I chose the truth, even when it cost me everything I thought I had. That choice I have found is the only one I have never regretted.